Dad packed his hunter starter pack, 2 Snickers bars, a gallon of water, a half gallon of milk, 2 protein bars, and a handful of Slim Jims. He was dressed in camouflage with his yellow sunglasses, the ones he bought off the TV. I didn't have the kind of gear he did, so I settled on hand-me-downs from Pat, a camo t-shirt, hiking boots, and tan khakis. In a moment of muscle memory, I texted him to make sure it was okay to wear his stuff. It took me halfway through the message to remember he wasn't going to respond. I put my phone in my pocket and followed Dad out the door. We got in his pickup truck and drove toward our destination. I didn't know where the hunting grounds were, but Dad said they weren't far. Outside, the sun was crawling into the sky, turning the black into shades of purple and red. I didn't know why we had to leave so early. Dad never explained it, and I never asked. "We just need to get one thing clear today, aight?" Dad chewed on tobacco as he talked. "What is it?" I asked. "When we have the shot, we can't hesitate," he said. "Yeah, sure," I said. Dad took Pat hunting every year, and all I heard was how good of a shot Pat was. Personally, I preferred video games and horror movies to sitting in the mud and killing woodland creatures. Mom and I would prepare the post-hunting feast of ribeyes and baked potatoes, which at least earned me some brownie points from Dad. When we hit the highway, Dad took the exit south towards Pittsburgh, which I thought was odd. I didn't know much about hunting, but I knew there were a lot more deer in the Allegheny Mountains than there were by the stadiums. "Do we need to get supplies or something?" I asked. Dad picked up an old Sheets cup and spit into it. "Nope." We ended up in Squirrel Hill just northeast of downtown, which had big colonial houses and a boutique movie theater. Mom took me there once to see Booksmart because it wasn't playing at the Cineplex in our town. We ate Bunch of Crunch and popcorn, our shoulders bumping as we laughed. Dad never went to neighborhoods like this though. He hated yuppies. After a few more minutes of driving, we pulled into a hiking trail parking lot. Ahead of us, I could see a neighborhood through the trees. The trail ran along their backyards. We were the only car on the lot. Dad didn't say anything as he went to the bed and grabbed his rifle. I stayed in the truck, waiting for my orders. When it was time to hunt, Dad knocked on my window. I opened the door and followed him onto the trail. "I bet you like how quiet the house has gotten," Dad said. I was walking behind him, carefully dodging the sticks he snapped with his boots. "Do I like that the house is quiet?" "You're an indoor kid," he said, "and the house was loud with everyone in it. I loved your mom, but she had opinions almost as big as mine. Pat and I mostly agreed, but he was starting to get a mind of his own." Dad laughed as he spit more tobacco in the mud. Ahead of us, the neighborhood was getting closer. "I don't like the quiet," I said. Dad nodded as he slipped the bullet into the rifle. I was surprised how close the neighborhood was to the hunting grounds. When I imagined hunting, I pictured men dudes in tree houses on the side of a mountain, no people in sight. Wouldn't people here be scared by the gunshot? "I like quiet when I choose the quiet," Dad said. "We didn't choose our quiet, did we?" I didn't say anything. Instead, I chewed on the inside of my cheek. After a few bites, I could taste blood. "I have to live in a quiet house because of another man's decision," Dad went on. "Do you know how many times I was drunk in a bar and had the thought of just driving home? I'm not a rich man. I couldn't afford a $20 cab every time I want to buzz, but I called one every time. I knew there were moms and kids out on those roads, and I didn't want their blood on my hands." Dad stopped walking. "Is that 411? He asked, pointing to a house. I studied it. In the distance, I could see the mailbox. 411 was written in block letters on the side. "I think so," I said. The house was straight out of a James Bond movie. Massive windows, a back deck that was wrapped around the first floor, Greek statues. There was a pool and a waterfall in the backyard. Although it was still early in the morning, there was a kid and a mom out by the water. The boy, probably about preschool age, had a remote in his hand. There was a small boat circling in the water. Dad took a knee and lifted the scope out of his bag. He slid it on the rifle. "Have you learned about STDs?" Dad was whispering now. He looked through the scope and adjusted it. It took him 3 times to get it right. His hand was shaking. "STDs?" I asked. "Diseases with crazy names getting passed from person to person," Dad said. "You have a fun night with a girl and wake up with a fist-sized lip. You know about those, right?" I nodded. I looked back at the woman and kid. She was kneeling down next to him, rubbing his shoulder. She had this big smile on her face, like this kid operating this boat was the greatest thing to ever exist. She reminded me of Mom. "You know about that?" Dad asked. He was laying on his belly in the mud now. The rifle was pointed to the house with the waterfall pool. "Know about what?" "How diseases can transmit between people." He was getting frustrated. "Sure, yeah, why?" "Pain is like an STD, he said. People give it to each other. If you have a lot of pain in your life, you need to be responsible. Transferring pain to someone is never innocent." Sweat broke out on my forehead. I didn't like the way Dad was talking. It was the same way he talked when he got the news about Mom and Pat. "Where are the hunting grounds?" I asked. Dad cocked his rifle. "The man who owns that house gave us a lot of pain," he said. I looked back through the trees. The pieces were coming together. "No, Dad," I said. "We need to go home." "Did you know that he left the hospital after 2 hours?" "What?" "Mom and Pat are sitting dead in a car, and he's skipping home to his family," Dad said. "He only had a couple of bruises." Dad pressed his eye against the scope. "We need to redistribute our pain," he said. I never went against my dad. He and I didn't have the best relationship, but there was a silent understanding between us. Stay out of my way, and I'll stay out of yours. But there was nothing to be understood here. Dad took a long, slow breath. As he exhaled, I dropped down and shoved the rifle's barrel into the dirt. "Hey!" he barked, pushing me back. "Let's go home," I said. "We don't have a home," he said. Dad turned on his side and kicked me. His foot landed hard into my stomach, sending me back into the mud. "Please don't do this," I said. I tried moving closer again, but it hurt too much. When I breathed, I could feel the sharp edge of my rib puncturing something. I took short, wispy inhales like a wounded animal. Dad didn't look at me. He kept his focus on the woman and child. "This is for you, baby doll," he whispered. The sound of his rifle echoed through the forest. I closed my eyes and buried my face in the mud. As the ripples of the blast softened, I heard a splash. I lifted my head out of the grass, blade by blade. The remote-controlled boat was still doing circles. The woman was looking into the pool, her eyes as wide as dinner plates. She stood quiet for a moment. When she finally screamed, her eyes didn't change. The only thing that moved was her mouth. It dropped open like a nutcracker's. The sound she made was raw and cavernous. As the boat slowed to a stop, the water under it turned purple, then brown, then red. Dad took his face away from the scope and cried. It wasn't the way he cried at Mom and Pat's funeral. Those were back straight, tough guy cries. These were different. He wept like a kid who didn't get the right toy for Christmas. Then, as if hypnotized, Dad stood up, wiped the dirt off his overalls, then walked back toward the car. I watched him walk down the path, his posture caved in. I wanted to run up and grab him, tackle him, punch in those stupid eyes, but I couldn't. When I tried to move, my body didn't respond. The woman's cries echoed closer to me, as if I was the god she was begging to. I wanted to vomit. I didn't know if Dad's pain went away, but mine began to grow. When news of his arrest arrived, I was the least surprised. My mother outright denied the statement, simply refused even the suggestion that my father could commit such a heinous crime as the one detailed by the reporting officer. My brother, 2 years younger and more inclined to my way of thinking, regarded the news as something to have been expected. My very young, vacant-minded sister failed to grasp the severity of the crimes and simply took the announcement as something generally bad. The circumstances from which my father would assuredly free himself, as his made-up heroes had done during their father-daughter story time. He was being held without bail at the jailhouse about a 20-minute drive from our home, and at the demand of our mother, we all loaded up into the family SUV and drove to meet our intern dad. He sat alone in a spacious cell, presumably used to house multiple criminals in one room, though our town wasn't known for criminality or anything really, and looked very upset. His dark blue jeans had various cuts in the fabric as if torn by fingernails, something my mother pretended not to notice. His black sweater had at some point been splattered by something, and since I didn't remember him leaving the home in the morning with any stains, I assumed they were obtained during his alleged criminal act. His skin, which had been almost orange from the unyielding summer sun, was now unbelievably pale, as if he had been dipped in white paint and left to dry somewhere cold and lightless. Black hair, previously combed back, now sat in a downward-felled mess covering his forehead and his right eye. He didn't seem to mind the obstruction of vision. The officer who had led us to his cell said we had 10 minutes to speak with our father, and that due to the nature of my father's crime, he would have to remain in the corridor to supervise. We don't have a family lawyer, we've never needed one, and the suggestion of an attorney's presence was either unheard or ignored by my distraught mother. My sister, finally realizing the realness of the situation, ran to my father and hugged him. He didn't seem to notice. Her embrace nor our gathering in the room. He just stared at the floor, eyes set deep in his face, encircled by darkness born of tiredness or fright, while his mouth hung open and breathless. That's what unnerved me most. In the large, quiet room where in any other city several prisoners would be held, but in this one, only our father resided. You could hear even the smallest sound. I heard my mother's unstable, ragged breathing, my brother's deep, self-calming respiration, and my sister's heavy gulps of air between her sobs. My own breathing was as steady as I could keep it, but no exhalations could be heard from my father. He just sat there as motionless as a cadaver, staring into oblivion or gazing upon some remembered horror. When it became obvious that my father would not respond to our questions, of which there were many, even from myself and my brother, we left him alone and returned to the officer, who escorted us upstairs and into the lobby of the station. In another city, the building would have seemed underfunded, the officers ill-equipped to handle even a slow day's worth of crime, but in our town, the police openly expressed themselves to be bored out of their minds. Some even jokingly wished for an uptick in crime, but I highly doubt the charges laid against my father were what those sentinels of peace had in mind. They laid out the full details, and due to my father's lack of cooperation, hadn't felt the need to spare us the grislier aspects. They were furious with him, absolutely disgusted by what had transpired, and I realized that the suggestion of lawyering up was merely an admonishment of formality. They wanted my father locked up, or perhaps even dead. When all had been said and my mother had been given time to process what she had been told, we drove home in silence. During the ride, my sister stared out the window and pointed at random objects, mouthing imperceptible things to herself. Her child's mind wouldn't be able to fathom what she had overheard during our briefing at the station. My brother stared down at his hands, which rested palms down on his thighs, his face hard, unmoving. He was old enough to comprehend the things suggested, implied, and fully revealed. I could not see my mother's face, but I'm sure it was of similar visage to my brother's, though probably masked to some degree by what she thought was a comforting, everything'll be alright smile. My face was blank. I didn't need to come to terms with anything, and I had no difficulty in believing that my father could commit the atrocities of which he has been accused. I was aware of my father's predilection for violence. 6 days ago, a girl had gone missing. Her name was Kelly. The local news reported that she had wandered off from her short walk to school with friends after something in the woods caught her attention. The two girls with whom she had been walking did not follow her, even called out to her to return to the sidewalk, but she ignored them. They ran to school and told the staff, who ran into the woods, and when they could not find her, called the police, who dispatched several officers to assist in the search. After an hour with no success, the town was alerted to the situation and a full search party convened and dispersed throughout the woods and outlying neighborhoods. Today, after yet another unsuccessful morning search, a man walked into the police station holding a large bag. The man knelt in the lobby of the station, cradling the bag, eyes fixated on nothing in particular, but aimed at the general direction of the officers. They approached the man, asked what he held, and when he did not respond, they opened it. Their reactions were what you'd expect them to be. After the immediate shock wore off, they issued somber pats on the back of my father, who still had not spoken. They initially thought that in some gravely fortuitous lone man search he had recovered the body of the missing girl. It was only when an officer noticed my father's hands and torn jeans that the atmosphere of the room dramatically shifted. Guns were raised and leveled at my father, orders were barked aloud and into radios, and the gloom-befallen room was thrown into chaos. My father had, a tale reconstructed to the best accuracy possible given the evidence, abducted the girl during her sojourn into the woods. bisected her at the hips, hidden the lower half, and returned the upper portion of the station. The lower half, which was found in the rarely used freezer we keep in our basement, had been preserved for a hideous purpose. Apparently, the girl had been slain on the last day of her abduction, and my father had spent the previous few days behaving as if he had not been holding her captive somewhere. Where, we never found out. Why he kept her for so long before committing a secondary crime, we don't know. Some people believe the whole thing was some prolonged episode of insanity, making the largely uneducated assumption that years of heavy drinking had warped his mind, while others think it was the first of what would have been many murderous indulgences born of some genetic predisposition for savagery. My brother took offense at that, despite not having any knowledge to disprove the assertion. He was only 11, and the seed of evil could very be within him. I think that upset him more than the actual murder, the chance that he could one day carry out a similar act of diabolism. My birthday is in 2 days. Remember how I said I could very well believe my father had done such terrible things? Last year on my birthday, my father was late to my birthday party. He and my mother argued, and in my desire to have a birthday not ruined by fighting, I tried to break up the argument. My obviously drunk father pushed me, and I fell down our stairs, fracturing my spine. I was rendered permanently handicapped. My mother, hoping to preserve the family unit, reported the incident as an accident, that I had fallen while excitedly running up the stairs to retrieve a present. I didn't deny the story, only because I wanted to believe it was just an accident, that he hadn't truly meant to push me with such force. Whether my father's recent actions were born of immense guilt, or the sick joke of a twisted mind, I can't say, because I don't know. He won't speak to anyone, and from what I've heard during my mother's phone calls with authorities, he won't be allowed back to civilization for quite some time, if ever. We plan on moving soon. I don't know if it'll be another small town, but I don't think it'll matter anymore. Even the smallest, most remote place can have crimes as awful as those in any big city. What keeps me up at night, what sends a chill through my inoperative spine, is the note that was attached to one of the poor girl's legs. It read, "Melissa, I'm sorry for what happened last year. Please forgive me. I got you some new legs, just your size. I know they're not exactly the same. Hers are a bit less toned, but it was the best I could do. I mean, she just stumbled into the woods while I was on my walk. I didn't even call out to her or anything. I hadn't thought of what to get you for your birthday that could make up for what I did last year, and those legs. Those legs! I just knew they'd be perfect for you. Please, Melissa, understand? From Dad."